The FBI has been sitting on the investigation into the Chinese spy balloon incident. Why hasn't it released its findings yet? It could be due to a Biden cover-up. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. A lot of people were none too happy with the way the Biden administration handled the Chinese spy balloon. It flew across the U.S. in early February. And that makes sense. It was ham-handed, clumsy, and some might even say incompetent. But what if I told you that it wasn't just incompetent? It might have been a botched cover-up. Before the spy balloon, the U.S.-China relationship had been chugging along pretty well. Sure, the Chinese Communist Party was committing genocide against the Uyghurs. It still had illegal police stations all over the world, including the U.S. And Chinese hackers were still hacking the U.S. government. But, hey, at least they didn't replace the U.S.'s sugar with salt, so they ruined their coffee. That would have been really annoying. Don't you hate pranks? So things were finally starting to look up. President Biden and Xi Jinping had met in Bali last November, where both leaders struck a warmer tone. Oh, it's nice to see old friends bonding, isn't it? They had agreed that Secretary of State Antony Blinken would travel to China to continue their path to warmer ties. And Blinken was scheduled to travel to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping. Then, the very week that Blinken was supposed to head to China, the spy balloon became public. Or as Biden put it last month,
and then this silly balloon that was carrying 2 freight cars worth of spying equipment was flying over the United States, and it got shot down, and everything changed in terms of talking to one another.
Yeah, that silly spy balloon. So silly, I can't believe I'm not laughing. What does he call predator drones? Whimsical? China violated U.S. airspace, broke international law, and spied on sensitive U.S. military sites. And that's according to the White House, not me. But if you think it's bad that Biden called all that silly, it gets so much worse. Recent news reports suggest that not only did the Biden administration waffle for almost a week about whether to cancel Blinken's trip after they found out about the balloon, but from the very beginning, they tried to sweep it under the rug in order to make Blinken's meeting in Beijing happen. Because Blinken was so looking forward to that trip. We can't let some silly, egregious violations of national sovereignty disappoint this little scamp. To understand just how badly the Biden administration tried to cover it up, it helps to understand the timeline. According to the White House, Biden was briefed about the spy balloon on Tuesday, January 31st. The next day, there was a ground stop at the Billings, Montana airport, and several residents reported seeing a balloon in the sky. That same day, Blinken said he ordered it shot down as soon as possible. The Department of Defense, or DoD, recommended shooting it down over water to avoid injuring people on land, and Biden took that advice. The day after that, February 2nd, the Department of Defense told the public what was going on, saying they were confident it was a Chinese spy balloon. A senior DoD official told reporters they knew it was China's because instances of this kind of balloon activity have been observed previously over the past several years. I'll talk more about that in a bit. He also admitted that it had entered the continental United States airspace a couple of days ago, and that the U.S. had been tracking it for some time. A Chinese spy balloon was in the U.S. for a couple of days, and they were just watching it like the extended director's cut of the Macy's Day Parade? Great defense. Glad the U.S. has a whole department devoted to it. According to the Washington Post, that sometime was almost a week because they had tracked it all the way from liftoff in China. Also, according to the Post, it first entered U.S. airspace on Saturday, January 28th over Alaska, 5 days before the Biden administration made it public. So yeah, I'm not sure which is worse. The fact that Biden wasn't briefed until 3 days after it crossed into the U.S., or the fact that it was tracked all the way from China and the U.S. totally winged its response. In their defense, maybe they thought this balloon was on its way to a birthday party and they didn't want to spoil it in case it was supposed to be a surprise. So far, The response seems haphazard, but it gets even worse. I'll tell you how right after this short commercial break. Welcome back. We now know that the U.S. tracked the Chinese spy balloon that flew over the United States in early February from liftoff, but according to the White House, Biden didn't hear about it until it had been in U.S. airspace for 3 days, and the public didn't hear about it until 2 days after that. In the end, the spy balloon wasn't shot down until it had already traveled across the entire continental U.S. And that raises some concerns. Now, the White House and the DoD have repeatedly said they didn't think this balloon could gather intelligence above and beyond what China could already collect with its satellites. And they also said they were taking steps to mitigate any foreign intelligence risk, which I guess meant protecting sensitive military sites the balloon hovered over somehow better than before. They also claimed that since it was up over 60,000 feet, it didn't pose a threat to airplanes, and that by allowing it to travel over the continental U.S., they were able to flip the script on China, because they could gather intelligence on how China's spy balloon program operated. It's like saying you let someone shoot you so you could collect the bullets. I'm beginning to worry the Department of Defense doesn't know how defense works. So is any of that true? Well, NBC reported that the balloon was sending intelligence back to China. Maybe not intelligence that was all that useful, but sending intelligence nonetheless. The White House said it couldn't confirm that, but it also didn't deny it, which makes you think they're not that confident it didn't pose any intelligence risk. The more I hear about this, the more I suspect the folks handling this don't pose much risk of having any intelligence either. But even if all they said is true, as well as what the White House said about Biden putting the safety of the security of the American people first by letting it cross over the entire U.S., it's easy to get the sense that if some people in Montana hadn't looked up at the sky at the right time and taken photos, we might not have ever known about it. Especially since the White House and the DoD both say this has happened at least 4 times before. Once, even during the Biden administration.
Is this the first Chinese balloon that the U.S. identified flying over U.S. airspace under this administration?
The Chinese surveillance balloons program has been around for some time. We even briefed Congress this past August.
How is it possible that this administration discovered at least 3 previous balloons that flew over the U.S. under the previous administration, but Trump officials didn't know it was happening?
Yeah, so look, I think that, and we have talked about this before, about how when the PRC government surveillance balloons transited the continental U.S. briefly, at least 3 times, as you just mentioned, during the president's prior administration, and once that we know of the beginning of this administration's, but never for this duration of time, as we know.
It happened during the Trump administration? You know what that means. If he becomes president again, his wall is going to be way taller. Now, the Biden administration has said this has been going on for several years, but hasn't actually said how many times, at least not that we could find. But it never told the American public. And only in February, when the spotlight was on the Biden administration, did it tell some 40 other countries they also had a Chinese spy balloon problem. Gee, after all these years of Chinese spy balloons quietly zooming around other countries' airspace, suddenly the U.S. is warning other countries. Unfortunately, though, it gets worse. Going back to the timeline, it took until Friday for the State Department to call off Blinken's trip to Beijing, just hours before he was supposed to leave. That poor, disappointed little scamp. When asked why it took so long to make that decision, here's what the State Department had to say.
Obviously, we were traveling early in the week to the Middle East. We were in Egypt, Israel, the West Bank, when this first started to percolate. The secretary was deeply engaged with his counterparts as well as with the president on this issue throughout the course of the week and as the end of the week neared. And ultimately, Dylan, these are difficult decisions. They are difficult decisions regarding the most prudent course to take with a high-altitude surveillance balloon like this. there are difficult diplomatic decisions to make.
I'm not sure what he thinks is difficult here. China just violated your airspace, which you claim breaks international law. It tried to collect sensitive information on your military bases. Was this really a difficult diplomatic decision to make? Apparently, it was a hard decision because the State Department emphasized right from the get-go that Blinken's trip was only postponed, not canceled.
We continue to believe that having open lines of communication is important. Indeed, this incident only underscores the importance, and that's why we will maintain them. And that's also why, when conditions permit, I plan to go to China.
Phew, I was worried for a second that China might actually suffer some diplomatic consequences for this. Now, to be fair to the administration, the Commerce Department did add 6 Chinese companies to its entity list a week later. That'll show them. The companies added to the entity list were supposedly tied to China's military aerospace programs, including airships and balloons and related materials and components. This means they can't buy U.S. goods or technology unless they get a license. And according to the Commerce Department, those licenses are likely to be denied. Yeah, we'll teach them a lesson. Make them wade through our bureaucracy, and then they'll be really sorry. Even though, despite what they say, the Commerce Department actually mostly approves those licenses. Now, just for comparison, the Trump administration also dealt with a Chinese spy operation on U.S. soil, specifically out of the Chinese consulate in Houston. U.S. officials said the Houston consulate had long been used by China's government to steal medical research and to try to infiltrate the oil industry. So what did Trump do? He shut it down. He literally closed down the entire Houston consulate and sent the staff home. And just so you don't think I'm only picking on Biden, even the Biden administration has done better than this. Last year, it expelled 12 Russian diplomats at the UN for allegedly engaging in espionage. So clearly, Biden knows how to throw out diplomats if he wants to. And I don't know about you, but I would say a spy balloon in U.S. airspace definitely rises to that standard. To be precise, it rises over 60,000 feet to that standard. That's going to need to be one massive wall. So what exactly did happen? I'll tell you the real behind-the-scenes story of just how cringy this whole thing is right after this quick commercial break. Welcome back. So the U.S. tracked a spy balloon all the way from China, but didn't shoot it down until it had crossed the entire continental U.S. I still can't get over that. The head of the North American Aerospace Defense Command said this was because he didn't assess it was a military threat or having hostile intent, so therefore he couldn't take immediate action. No, I'm not sure what constitutes a military threat, but I would say knowing it's a spy balloon from a hostile country entering your airspace and spying on your military bases, that sure sounds like a military threat to me. Am I missing something here? The Biden administration also failed to say anything publicly about it for 5 days after it entered U.S. airspace, then revealed that this is part of a years-long Chinese spy balloon program that has targeted the U.S. as well as other countries. China, of course, initially denied all this, claiming it was a civilian weather balloon that went off course multiple times over several years and always ended up over military bases. Then, when the U.S. stubbornly insisted it wasn't a weather balloon, China claimed the U.S. was deliberately hyping up the matter. Since this was a totally innocent weather balloon, it was not fishy at all that China asked for the pieces back. Clearly, China had nothing to hide. It just wanted to make sure its trash was recycled properly. You know China, always looking out for the planet. Then, China claimed the U.S. had sent spy balloons into Chinese airspace over 10 times. Because, when you can't beat them, join them. Now, you may be wondering what happened to the spy balloon debris that was picked up off the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, you're not alone. The DoD said in April the FBI was still doing their assessment. It's now June, and as of this recording, the findings of the FBI investigation still haven't been released. What's taking them so long? Are they reaching out to everyone born that week to super make sure this wasn't on its way to a surprise party? I'll get into the reason in a minute, but first, we do know more about what was on the balloon thanks to classified documents that were leaked by Jack Teixeira, a member of the Massachusetts Air National Guard. According to the Washington Post, the balloon carried a raft of sensors and antennas the U.S. government still had not identified more than a week after shooting it down. Intelligence analysts assessed that it could generate enough power to operate any surveillance and reconnaissance technology, including a type of radar that can see at night and through clouds and thin materials. So yeah, this is not sounding like something you want flying over your sensitive military installations, even if you've secured them. But I think the real outrage here is how this is reportedly being handled by the State Department. I talked before about how Blinken really wanted to keep his trip to Beijing, and was even debating for days after learning about the spy balloon whether he should go or not. He eventually postponed it, but only because it would have significantly narrowed the agenda of his meeting. Yeah, when the people you're visiting got caught spying on your country, it kind of ruins all the small talk. Gee, did you watch Secession last night? When you weren't watching our military installations? I guess that means instead of focusing on all the threats from China, it would mostly focus on this one. That would be a real tragedy. How will the U.S.-China relationship ever recover if the U.S. can't air its grievances while China ignores them? In order to get back into China's good graces, though, the State Department is reportedly withholding the FBI's findings at China's request. One Chinese official confirmed to Reuters that a renewed Blinken visit would be more likely if the U.S. accommodated Beijing's wish to shelve the balloon issue, adding that China had conveyed it did not want the FBI to release details of its investigation into the downed balloon. Yeah, just give in to China this one time and it'll never ask for anything else. China won't see this as a sign of weakness that it'll exploit over and over. It just needs to know the U.S. is in a committed relationship. Also, it's weird that this is what China's embarrassed about. Sure, talk all you want about the genocide, secret police stations, and the hacking, but not the balloon. That's just too silly. Unfortunately, it's not just the FBI. According to Reuters, the State Department held back human rights-related sanctions, export controls, and other sensitive actions to try to limit damage to the U.S.-China relationship. Sources told Reuters these delays were mainly due to Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, who Blinken put in charge of China affairs. After Reuters published its report saying that the U.S. was delaying China sanctions and naming Sherman as a culprit, she announced her retirement. And I'm sure it was a complete coincidence it was just a day after Reuters published its report. Do the people in the government watch Dr. Strangelove and think, man, I hope we can be that competent someday? It wasn't just her, though. According to Reuters, an email sent to State Department staff said guidance from Secretary of State is to push non-balloon actions to the right so we can focus on symmetric and calibrated response. We can revisit other actions in a few weeks. That email was sent on February 6th, just 2 days after the spy balloon was shot down. And as far as we know, those actions still haven't been taken back up. The sender of that email, Rick Waters, was the head of China House, the State Department's recently created division to coordinate Biden's China policy. Sources told Reuters that morale at China House has been low because of all the backsliding on things like enforcing human rights and economic sanctions. 4 sources told Reuters there were staffing struggles at China House, with vacancy rates as high as 40%. Man, morale is making those employees disappear faster than China makes dissidents disappear with no consequences. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that Rick Waters, who was the head of China House, announced recently that he's stepping down. One staff member described their frustration at the State Department's tiptoeing around China, saying, even when we are on the 1-yard line, we debate whether we should cross. China House staff are reportedly worried that the State Department is going to back the failed Kissinger style of diplomacy, which is all about giving China whatever it wants and hoping things turn out for the best. So after all this kowtowing to Beijing, has Blinken rescheduled his meeting with Xi Jinping? Not so far. He did speak to his counterpart in February, but he remains hopeful he will meet Xi Jinping this year. Because for China appeasers, hope springs eternal. But hey, once the hubbub from that silly spy balloon blows over, I'm sure he'll get his meeting. After all, Biden is predicting that there will be a thaw very shortly.
And then this silly balloon that was carrying 2 freight cars worth of spying equipment was flying over the United States, and it got shot down, and everything changed in terms of talking to one another. I think you're going to see that begin to thaw very shortly.
And hopefully, with all the appeasing, China will knock off all of its atrocities and, most importantly of all, not replace the U.S.'s sugar with salt. Because genocide is one thing, but pranks, that we can't allow. So what do you think of how the Biden administration handled the spy balloon incident? Let us know in the comments below. And this show would not exist without support from viewers like you. YouTube frequently demonetizes, suppresses, and secretly unsubscribes people from this channel. Join what I call the China Uncensored 50-cent army by contributing to the show on Patreon. You'll get a bunch of cool perks, including the ability to ask me questions I'll answer on the show. And today's question comes from Bunny Star. Do you think eventually the youth of China will have enough of the CCP and form their own type of French Revolution? Very interesting question. So there's good reason to think China's youth is fed up with communism. They can't find jobs, and Xi just tells them to eat bitterness. Even let them eat cake was better than that. The hopeless situation has led to a lot of social phenomenon like the lay flat movement or the let it rot movement. I did a whole episode about those. Check it out. And during the massive COVID protests at the end of last year, people were even saying CCP stepped down, Xi Jinping stepped down. So while I do sincerely hope the CCP collapses soon, even if it means putting me out of a job, I hope they don't have a French Revolution. The French Revolution was really a proto-communist revolution. It was horrible and bloody and did irreparable damage to French society. And if you actually look at the data, nonviolent revolutions in the 20th century are much more likely to succeed and result in a democracy than violent revolutions. Now, that's not to say there shouldn't be justice for everything the CCP has done, including possible executions. But the CCP got everybody's hands dirty. They used Chinese people to attack other Chinese people. Nobody's hands are bloodless. So more mass killings really won't be the answer for China. Thanks for your question, and thanks for your support, Bunny Star. And thank you for watching. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.